The city never slept, but it forgot. Every skyscraper that lit up the skyline like digital hieroglyphs told a story of deals made in daylight and erased by evening. Beneath the mirrored surfaces and the shine of ambitions fulfilled, another narrative pulsed, one that never made it into quarterly reports or press releases. Her story was buried in that silence. Monica didn't rise from comfort. She climbed from insulation, the kind that muffled dreams, disguised barriers as coincidences, and called underestimation a compliment. Her first office had been a borrowed Wi-Fi signal and a second-hand desk in a hallway too narrow to pace. The windows faced a brick wall. The budget was just enough for cheap coffee and a used laptop missing the N key. But what she built there couldn't be measured in capital. It began not with vision but necessity. Her mother's illness had collapsed a year of planning in a single diagnosis. The hospital paperwork didn't care how smart she was. The pharmacy lines didn't reward effort. The eviction notice on the apartment door came with no warning, no grace. And when she asked for help, not out of desperation but strategy, the investors who had smiled during pitch week stopped answering emails. They told her she was too early, too raw, too niche, too technical, too female, too much. So she built anyway. One app, one co-base, one freelance client after another. She worked while her friends drank. She coded while others pitched. She studied tax law at night, marketing in the morning, and data integration over weekends. She didn't have a team, she had a borrowed server and an instinct that scale was not about hype but depth. And when the money ran out, she didn't pivot. She persisted. The company grew in silence. No viral moment. No trending hashtag. Just word of mouth, slow, sure, unstoppable. The app that saved startups money. The infrastructure that kept nonprofits online during funding freezes. The backend that major firms used without knowing it came from her code. The first acquisition offer came from a former colleague, the same one who once joked she was smart for someone who never did YC. He offered her half of what her intellectual property was worth. She declined with a thank you note and launched a new server cluster that same night. Then came the firm. Established. Respected. Arrogant. They needed her tech. Not her. Not her leadership. Not her style. Not her story. Just the efficiency her system provided, the elegance of her code that kept error rates under 0.01% even under pressure. She didn't answer. She bought time. She hired slowly. Engineers who had been rejected for being too academic or too blunt. Mothers returning to tech after being dismissed by recruiters. Neurodivergent analysts whose quiet brilliance had been buried beneath loud culture fits. She didn't recruit them out of charity. She recruited them because they were lethal. She didn't offer ping-pong tables. She offered equity. When the firm called again, she was ready. They wanted licensing. She wanted legacy. They offered an integration. She offered an acquisition. Not of her, of them. Because while they watched her, she had watched the industry, memorized every loophole, reverse-engineered every contract, learned the M and a game not through mentorship but through relentless nights reading filings, dissecting case studies, tracking trends. She didn't outcode them. She outstructured them. And when the boardroom buzzed with rumors that a mystery buyer had begun snapping up their peripheral assets, cloud storage subsidiaries, analytics tools, even the catering firm for their internal events, no one guessed it was her. Because people like her weren't supposed to be able to move that quietly. Or that strategically. The last shares changed hands 2 weeks before the confrontation. A holding company dissolved. A new one formed. And her name, once missing from their contact lists, now appeared at the top of every internal directive. She walked into the meeting room not to challenge power, but to reveal it. Because the era of begging to be let in was over. She wasn't asking for a seat. She now owned the table. The marble floors of the building glistened with practiced perfection. A rotating sculpture spun silently in the lobby, commissioned art meant to evoke innovation, but really just another symbol of how money expressed itself when it ran out of purpose. Executives passed by with eyes that didn't scan, they filtered. Shoes clicked. Phones blinked. Names were remembered only if they opened doors. That morning, the building smelled like polished ambition and subtle dread. The email had arrived at 7:03 a.m. sharp. Mandatory attendance, leadership restructuring review. No delegations permitted. The subject line sounded innocuous, but it rang with urgency. Within 20 minutes, managers abandoned early coffee runs. Department heads canceled calls. And by 8 o'clock, the top-floor conference room, known only as the atrium, was filled with people used to control. They didn't know who had called the meeting, but they felt it. The room was rectangular, wall-to-wall glass on 3 sides, showcasing the financial district as if success itself were a backdrop. The long table had no nameplates that day, only tablets synced to a private network. Most assumed it was a quarterly update. A few suspected more. But none were ready for what came next. She entered without announcement. There was no assistant leading the way. No peer handler. No preliminary statement. Just Monica. Not with dramatic flair. Not with vengeance. But with gravity. She carried a single black folder, thin and unadorned, tucked under one arm. She didn't pause at the doorway. She didn't scan for reaction. She moved with the certainty of someone who no longer required confirmation of her place. As she approached the table, several people straightened reflexively, not out of recognition but out of instinct. Something in her presence disrupted their calibration of hierarchy. The unspoken architecture of status they had relied on their entire careers began to crack. She stopped at the head of the table. The seat typically reserved for the former CEO, a man who prided himself on always arriving last. A man who wasn't here. Not anymore. She placed the folder down gently. Opened it. Inside, a single sheet of embossed paper. She slid it forward, facing the room. No one leaned in to read it, not yet. They waited. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, they knew. It wasn't just a memo. It was ownership. Her eyes scanned the room. Not aggressively. Not challenging. But cleanly, like someone who had once sat on the other side of glass doors, waiting for meetings she was never invited to. Someone who had learned that silence was not always absence, sometimes it was observation. Sometimes it was resistance in waiting. Now the wait was over. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The projector came to life on cue. Not with a mission statement. Not with a vision board. With signatures. Legal documentation. Slide after slide. Acquisition terms. Leadership transitions. Operational controls. Her name wasn't just on the paperwork. It was written into the infrastructure. Into the bylaws. Into the irrevocable clauses of transfer that had been drafted by lawyers who understood power in its purest form, control without appearance. A name they didn't expect was now behind every door they thought they owned. Someone rose. Someone else muttered. But the murmurs weren't defiance. They were recalibration. She flipped to the next slide. And there it was. The org chart. The old leadership hierarchy deleted. A new structure. Her at the apex. 3 tiers down, the name of the man who had once told her to leave the meeting room appeared again, now labeled, Senior Advisor, Transition Period Only. Silence. The room no longer breathed. It watched. Because this wasn't a takeover. This was exposure. A dismantling of assumption. A reminder that behind every ignored resume, every dismissed proposal, every patronizing smile was a ledger. And Monica had kept the receipts. She had seen the system not from within, but from below. From the overlooked corners of hiring calls, investment rejections, speaking panels where she was never invited. And from those vantage points, she had built something not just resistant to exclusion, but engineered for justice. Not performative justice. Structural justice. The kind that rewrote policy before it ever became press. She walked around the table now. Slowly. Each step not threatening, but clarifying. She stopped behind one of the executives. A man who had once spoken over her during a panel where she was a last-minute invitee. He hadn't remembered her then. He did now. She placed a second folder in front of him. Inside, performance audits, expense reports, and a letter of release. He didn't protest. He knew. Because the rules had not changed. Only who enforced them. And now they were being applied in full. She continued. 3 more folders. 3 more transitions. She was not here to humiliate. She was here to transform. By the time she returned to her seat, the one they tried to keep empty, the meeting had already ended, though no one had stood. What she left behind was not disruption. It was blueprint. A roadmap for every person who had ever been told, you don't belong in this room. Because now she didn't just belong in the room. She owned the building. In the weeks that followed the meeting room reveal, the company entered a state of organized confusion. On paper, operations continued. Memos were distributed, schedules maintained, systems synced. But beneath the surface, an invisible quake shifted everything familiar. Old hierarchies didn't vanish, they evaporated. Not in fire, but in exposure. There was no coup. There were no layoffs broadcast on financial news channels. There was only order, a new one, moving forward like quiet water, cleansing the rot. She arrived early every day. Not for optics. For control. She walked the building slowly, floor by floor, not as an overseer, but as an auditor of culture. Her heels echoed in marketing halls, engineering labs, and finance cubes. She watched how conversations died mid-sentence when she passed. Not out of fear, out of realization. This was no longer their place. It was hers. But she wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in reconstruction. She had spent years studying how exclusion was manufactured. It didn't come as insults or slurs. It came as architecture. Whose desk faced the window? Who got CC'd on early emails? Who spoke first in meetings? Who had an office and who had a shared pod? Whose opinions were considered strategy and whose were called insights? She had mapped every corner of institutional exclusion, and now she was here to raise it. Her first initiative didn't appear in headlines. It began in facilities. Private offices for VPs were reduced. Walls came down. Not metaphorically, literally. She turned the top floor into a shared command center. Leadership sat with departments. Interdisciplinary pods replaced silos. Conference rooms were renamed not after founders but after engineers and janitors whose contributions had been ignored. Quiet rooms were installed. Nursing stations. Gender-neutral bathrooms. Every suggestion previously labeled logistically complicated was executed in weeks. Resistance came. Quiet, measured, deeply coded. Emails questioned the efficiency of shared spaces. Memos suggested risk in lowering formality optics. Whispers in elevators spoke of overcorrection. She didn't reply. She redesigned the systems that made such whispers matter. The performance evaluation framework was overhauled. No longer based on visibility or hours logged, but on impact verified anonymously by those affected. Promotions now required 2 layers of cross-functional endorsement. Compensation matrices became transparent. Salary bands were published. Raises required public justification. Middle managers who had built their kingdoms on ambiguity began to vanish. Some resigned. Others tried to pivot to reframe themselves as allies. She welcomed neither nor retaliated. She simply enforced the new structure. No one was irreplaceable. Except culture. HR became the sharpest tool in her arsenal. Not a shield for executives, but a mirror for the entire company. She hired investigators, compliance officers, behavioral analysts, not to punish, to map patterns of bias, trends in attrition, feedback loops silenced by fear. She launched a silent survey across all departments. Questions were weighted, cross-referenced, analyzed. A heat map of toxicity emerged, not as isolated incidents but as design flaws. She corrected them all, publicly, visibly, without performative panels or glossy diversity campaigns. She believed in policy, not apology, in structure, not slogans, in permanence, not pressure. And through it all, she remained still, not distant, centered. She didn't post thought pieces. She didn't attend startup mixers. She didn't sit on panels. She sat in silence, reviewing every contract, every license renewal, every vendor list. She found overspending in consulting, collusion in procurement, negligence in onboarding. She cleaned house with surgical precision. And as the weeks turned to months, something impossible began to happen. People stopped asking who she was. They began asking how she had done it. Because the company was growing. Faster, smarter, quieter. Employee satisfaction reached record highs. Attrition fell below industry standards. Revenues grew not from legacy clients, but from new partnerships formed on trust. Investors, once hesitant, now leaned in. Not because they finally believed in her, but because they could no longer afford not to. In the media, her name still stirred discomfort. Not scandal, disruption. They didn't know how to label her. Not a founder, the company was old. Not a turnaround expert, she wasn't on retainer. Not a diversity hire, she owned the hiring board. She became a riddle to an industry built on certainties. But for her team, the ones who had been ignored, overlooked, underestimated, she wasn't a riddle. She was an answer to the question they had long abandoned. Can someone like me ever lead this? Now the answer walked beside them, wrote their checks, protected their hours, defended their joy, not with words, with policy, because she wasn't interested in being right. She was interested in being irreversible. The boardroom had once been a theater of curated performance. Leather-bound agendas, controlled glances, buzzwords inflated like balloons of ego. Decisions were choreographed. Dissent was punished by omission, and progress, real, lasting progress, had always been an inconvenience, postponed in favor of profitability dressed in legacy. That space had tried to keep her out. Now it bent to her. The quarterly board meeting began at precisely 9 a.m. The glass doors opened slowly, as they always had, revealing a room flooded with natural light. But the light no longer warmed old ideas. It illuminated new architecture. There were no nameplates on the table. There were no tiers of influence embedded in chair placement. The long central screen, once reserved for market outlooks, now displayed 3 lines of data: employee satisfaction, customer retention, and internal promotion ratio. Financials were still there, but beneath the metrics of human performance, not above. She entered, not with silence, but with steadiness. The board had changed. Not fully, not yet, but the core had shifted. 2 of the original founders had stepped down, not out of spite but weariness. They'd seen the tide turn and recognized their choice: legacy through ego or through evolution. To their credit, they had chosen the latter. She didn't celebrate their exit. She documented their contribution and folded it into the company's narrative. She had long believed that history must be preserved, but not as chains, as context. The new board included names the industry had not yet memorized: an indigenous legal scholar, a public policy veteran from rural infrastructure, a Black woman with deep roots in fintech who once ran a credit union from a storefront, and an autistic mathematician who saw economic systems as kinetic art. Together, they brought no polish, just precision. They didn't waste time posturing. They asked real questions, and she gave real answers. The meeting focused not on product lines but on impact channels, not on quarterly churn, but on long-term trust erosion. The conversation was rigorous, uncomfortable, brilliant, but what mattered more was what happened when the screens dimmed. As the meeting concluded, several board members lingered, not because they were unsure, but because they wanted to stay, to keep talking, to imagine. She remembered the meetings she had once been shut out of, the ones where ideas like these were deemed idealistic, impractical, unscalable. Now those same words were assets. Her greatest act wasn't flipping the board. It was flipping the board's language. They no longer asked, "How will this scale?" before asking, "Who does this protect?" They no longer asked, "What's the revenue impact?" before asking, "What's the community impact?" They no longer saw risk as something to hedge against. They saw it as something to redistribute from the shoulders of the vulnerable to the structure of the system. After the meeting, she returned to her office, not a corner suite, but a glass-walled room on the same floor as legal and product. The door was always open. Not a metaphor. Policy. She reviewed quarterly reflections submitted by new hires. They were raw, full of ideas not yet refined. But she read each one. She annotated. Not to correct, but to confirm. She built a culture where questioning the CEO wasn't punished. It was praised. Where failure wasn't minimized, but mapped. Where grace wasn't a bonus, it was an infrastructure line item. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed late, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be there when the night crew arrived. The janitorial team. The silent foundation of the entire machine. She greeted them by name. Not performatively, personally. They were on her payroll now. No more third-party contracts. No more wage arbitrage. No more invisibility. One of them had once opened the meeting room for her when she was still not allowed inside. Now he had keys to every floor. She had made sure of it. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm of transaction and distraction. But inside this company, inside this building, something else lived. A culture not of inclusion, but of inversion. Where those who were always assumed to be replaceable now formed the core. Where the meeting rooms that once locked her out now held her fingerprints on every surface. And where leadership wasn't a title. It was a function, a responsibility, a promise. And she had kept it. The world outside had started to notice. Not because of flashy ads or IPO rumors, but because competitors were quietly losing clients to her. Vendors were deferring contracts to get on her waitlist. Former skeptics were now quoting her internal memos in keynote speeches. But Monica didn't track press. She tracked patterns. She had always believed legacy wasn't what they wrote about you, it was what endured when your name faded. So she began designing for her own disappearance. Not retreat. Not resignation. Redundancy. She understood what few in power dared to confront. Real leadership wasn't about making herself irreplaceable. It was about making the principles she stood for unremovable. So she opened every process, every framework, every methodology. Her leadership philosophy became codified not in slogans but in software. She launched an internal system called Signal. Simple interface guiding navigation, access, and learning. At first, it sounded like another knowledge base. But it wasn't. Signal tracked invisible labor. It logged the emotional cost of ignored feedback. It monitored how often ideas were attributed to others. It flagged patterns of burnout not just by hours worked, but by interruption frequency. It showed how meetings shifted after women spoke, how performance reviews differed by accent, location, or perceived confidence. And it did something no tool had ever done before. It generated equity scores not for individuals, but for processes. Hiring flows, feedback loops, budget allocations, resource distributions. Everything was exposed. She didn't use it to punish. She used it to evolve. And because it was built openly, the source code available internally, teams began to adapt it. A queer employee in sales added modules to detect erasure during promotions. A black engineer layered data on systemic bias in bug attribution. A neurodiverse product lead created a rhythm tracker to balance deep work with communication overload. Signal became the cultural nervous system. Not a weapon, a compass. One day, she visited the server room that housed it. Not out of necessity, out of reverence. The racks blinked in quiet harmony. No applause. No headlines. Just continuity. That same week, she quietly stepped out of daily operations. No announcement. No send-off. She moved into a new role, infrastructure steward. The media didn't understand. Why would someone who had just turned a fractured firm into a global blueprint for ethical capitalism walk away from the title? But titles were never her currency. Structure was. The new CEO was someone from finance. A Latina whose spreadsheet audits had once unearthed an overlooked fraud ring no one else noticed. Monica had promoted her without fanfare, just trust. She watched from the shadows. Watched the new team debate. Watched them disagree fiercely and then resolve without hierarchy. Watched them protect interns from blame. Watched them rename an algorithm after its original undocumented author. Watched them reject an acquisition that would have doubled revenue but have community trust. Watched them say no when saying yes was easier. She smiled. Not because they followed her rules, but because they followed the principles beneath them. She walked through the building one last time before sunset. Past meeting rooms now named for doers, not donors. Past the security desk where guards were now salaried, not outsourced. Past a wall that used to display executive portraits, now replaced with murals of collective wins. She touched the glass of the old boardroom. It was still transparent, but now the transparency went both ways. She stepped outside. No cameras followed. No speech was given. She walked into the city, anonymous again, unburdened. Because what she had built could no longer be taken. It was not a building. It was not a brand. It was a system. And it carried her name in every action it inspired. It had been nearly a year since she left the daily floor. Her name still remained in the documents, embedded in code comments, annotated in archived decisions. But Monica herself had receded not into obscurity, but into permanence. A type of presence that didn't need reminding. Like infrastructure. Like gravity. The company she once dragged uphill now stood tall, not because of marketing, but because of memory. It remembered what it had been before her and what it vowed never to be again. And the world was watching. Universities started teaching her system design as case studies. NGOs consulted Signal for equitable budgeting. Venture funds began requiring internal bias audits before releasing Series B tranches. Other companies attempted to replicate her approach, some with sincerity, others with surface polish. But none succeeded the same way. Because her success wasn't in the technology. It was in the refusal. The refusal to be silenced. To be small. To be polite in the face of exclusion dressed in manners. One afternoon, a junior employee she had never met, a young black woman from a Midwestern state college, first generation, first job, stood outside the original meeting room. She had been scheduled to present a redesign proposal. But the room was full. Executives were in overflow discussions. The door was closed. For a moment, she hesitated. The hallway was long. Quiet. She held her prototype in hand. Shaking. Then the door opened. Not because someone invited her. Because the motion sensors were now designed to never lock anyone out by default. She stepped in. And those inside didn't silence her. They adjusted. They listened. They rewrote timelines. Because the systems were different now. not just on the surface. At the root, that meeting changed a product line. Months later, it changed an entire partnership strategy. Years later, it would change how accessibility standards were defined across industries. But that day, it simply changed her. She sent Monica an email, not to thank her, but to tell her that she had named her first internal tool ROMKY, a codebase that tracked who got into meetings, who spoke, who followed up, and who didn't. The signature on the email was short, but the message was vast. Monica read it in the middle of a quiet train ride. She was heading north toward a retreat off-grid. She closed the laptop slowly, not with nostalgia, with resolve. She understood something most leaders never did. Success is not ownership. It is replication. Not duplication, but replication of value, of defiance, of courage built into process. And she had done it. She looked out the window. The skyline faded behind her, but the architecture she had built remained in every meeting room that now expected the unexpected, in every seat that no longer belonged to assumption, in every intern whose first day no longer included proving they deserved to be heard, because she had walked through the fire of every locked door and turned the heat into blueprint. Now no one waited outside, because there was no longer a door to keep them out, only a system that invited them in.